everyone. Thank you for being here. It's day 3, and I promise today is also going to be a very exciting day. Well, Kailash, it's a pleasure to meet you again. I think the last time we had a podcast, we discussed one interesting term called pragmatic pessimist. And somewhere you said you relate to that. But if you think more about it, I think that's a very interesting lens to look at GenAI through. A little bit of pessimism as well. A lot of things is happening, obviously, with GenAI. And recently, there was even news on an Israeli regulator approving an AI startup for using a chatbot to do the stocks and invest in stocks with partnership with the bank. So now the question of how much of AI is a hype? I mean, are all these real practical use cases? So is it a hype or is there a real thing to it? Like, is GenAI for real?
It's both for sure. There's a whole new class of technologies that have emerged under the umbrella of AI in the last few years, and they're all real. But is there immense amounts of hype around them? For sure, absolutely. So it's a bit of, no, it's a lot of both. There's a lot of reality and there's a lot of hype. And specifically about the example you cited, the funny thing is AI research and computational AI machine learning research have been going on for 60 plus years, 50, 60 years. And some of the earliest use cases and attempts of using such technologies have been to make money in the stock markets. All through the 80s, Wall Street bet heavily on using machine learning technology. So the first use case people attempted was to make magic money out of stock markets with AI. So there's nothing new. And I don't even know why it's in the news that a chatbot got approved. People have been doing it even before generative AI for decades in stock markets.
So that's when it comes to finance, like adopting AI technology, I mean, it's always a little, I mean, people are a little wary about it. Like, there are a lot of risks to it, or are there like security concerns? So how is the current ecosystem managing through it? I mean, are they like completely adopting it, or they're still kind of taking it slow?
A couple of years ago, I shared a bunch of personal views around this, where I got really sick of enterprise sales spam, as I call it, where people were hawking and selling powered by AI, quote unquote, solutions in our industry, finance, technology, fintech, AI for fraud detection, AI for this, AI for that. This was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I can't recollect. But it was before the Gen AI explosion. But even at that point, it was so overdone and oversold, where a lot of people were claiming to use these things before they didn't even exist. So you can imagine how much that would have accelerated today when some of these technologies are now legit. So about adoption, again, it's a bit of both. There are a small fraction of organizations looking at adopting this meaningfully. A large number who are trying to really adopt it because everybody else is adopting it. But it's the same cycle all over again. When you had big data, everybody had big data. When you had something else, everybody had something else. So adoption is a mixed bag. Lots of hype, lots of adoption for the sake of adoption, and some meaningful adoption. It'll take a few years before it settles down to a reasonable level.
Got it. So just moving on from the GenAI, we'll get to that in a bit. I want to talk about open source community. So I think Zerodha has been known for embracing open source technologies, and you yourself are a big proponent of FOSS and free open software service. So how big of a thing is open source, developer ecosystem? Like, how important is it? I mean, is it really required for bringing technology to the next step?
Oh, absolutely. I think this massive and exponential explosion of generative AI technology is entirely driven by open source. The ecosystem of tools, the entire stack, deployment tools, development tools, all kinds of things, evaluation tools, the frameworks, developer frameworks, the entire developer experience, engineering experience, and tooling around this is all open source. Yes, OpenAI released their first set of models, which is what really kicked off this wave. So those are proprietary, large proprietary models, but setting models apart, there are high quality, open source or open weight models that are hitting the market. We've been experimenting with a few at Zerodha ourselves, but those are the models being open source or open weights. But the entire ecosystem of tools that you need to use these technologies, fully open source. And without that ecosystem, we wouldn't be talking about GenAI today.
So can you talk a bit about FOSS and how that growth has been for, say, the open source community that in India specifically? Like, what are some of the things that you're doing, or say Zerodha is doing, to kind of encourage this whole ecosystem?
I mean, so it's open source. I call it FOSS, free and open source software. It is so absolutely fundamental to Zerodha's existence. No open source, no Zerodha. No open source, no Indian startup ecosystem. No open source, no global technological explosion of the last 2 decades. Internet runs on open source technologies. Absolutely everything runs on open source technologies. The largest government systems run on open source technologies. Our phones all run Linux kernels, let's say Android phones. So open source is absolutely everywhere. Open source as a moment, open source as a model of building and distributing and collaborating on software, it's absolutely everywhere. One of my biggest gripes, and it continues to be a gripe, has been that in India, in the Indian context, the industry has largely failed to acknowledge, I mean, forget largely, has utterly failed to acknowledge the role of open source technologies in the development of the entire ecosystem. You pick any startup, small or big, you pick any tech company, they're all largely 90% built on open source technologies. We pick up the best databases, we pick up the best frameworks, we pick up the best programming languages. Just go download, install, build a business on top of it. But acknowledging that, absent. Giving money and support to open source projects, absent. So this is something we've been very cognizant of, and I'm personally very passionate about it. I'm an open source developer myself. So at Zerodha, from the very get-go, we've taken extreme care. We've been cautious of acknowledging, this was more than a decade ago. And as we became successful, as we had material and monetary resources, we started funding open source projects that we used freely. We helped set up the FOSS United Foundation, which is a non-profit foundation that works in India across open source communities to strengthen the open source system. And in fact, next week, we're launching a dedicated open source fund to fund critical open source projects globally. And as Zerodha, we also produce a lot of open source technologies ourselves, which we give out to the community. So these are all common sense things, and every organization should do at least some of these to the best of their capabilities.
So does it also mean the awareness is less? That could also be one reason why we're not developing these kind of community.
I can't, no, it's not an awareness thing. I mean, like I said, without open source technologies, there would be no startup ecosystem. Every tech company is built on these technologies. So the awareness absolutely exists within the engineering teams. But most enterprises, the management probably doesn't care about encouraging engineering teams to contribute back. Because software developers and engineers, they work with open source technologies every day, right? We hear of terms like React or React Native or Flutter. These are all open source technologies, and we use them freely. But unless an organization from the top down has that push and encouragement for a culture that gives back to open source technologies, it is not going to happen. And I think it's not a matter of awareness, I think it's a matter of callousness.
All right, so then I think Zerodha has always had a particular approach. Like, for example, when this AI wave started, and I think many were kind of saying AI will replace jobs. I mean, that fear kind of set in. But I think Zerodha was one of those very few companies which consciously said that, that's not going to happen. We're going to safeguard our employees. So how is that possible when you have so many companies actually saying that, what, AI can or cannot replace? But Zerodha has been very clear about, that's not going to happen.
That was a philosophical decision, not a technology or business decision. I can cite an example. So we've been experimenting with open source large language models for solving very specific problems within the organization, things to do with customer support, etc. And recently, some of these systems that we took online, where we just had one developer working on it, experimenting with it, it kind of invalidated the mundane, tedious, manual jobs a team of about 100 people were doing. And logically, if you look at it, those 100 jobs are lost. But last year, we took a call, and people were, when it was peak LLM hype, we took this call. We set up this policy where we explicitly stated that nobody at Zerodha is going to lose their job because just because we happen to adopt a certain technology. There'll be avenues for people to migrate to other roles and whatnot. And that's what's happening here. So it was a philosophical decision. It was a human-centric decision that we took. Nothing to do with AI in general. It could be any technology, any automation that outright invalidates a bunch of roles. And that has happened from time to time. So we've created an environment where even if that happens, the humans are not left hanging. They have other avenues to explore within the org.
So can you talk about some of the tools or something where you're already experimenting with AI, right? It's not that Zerodha is not doing it. So anything that you can talk about, like what you're experimenting with, or to what scale that would be implemented in your function?
This particular example I cited, it's a very tangible one. A lot of large organizations would face this. So we get hundreds of thousands of customer support calls every month. People call us every day, tens of thousands of calls per day. And we have a quality team, I think about 100 people, and their job is to randomly pick up and sample calls and analyze the quality of the customer support that our team delivered. Now you can imagine 100 people sifting through lakhs of calls, picking up a random sample, listening to 5-minute calls, listening to 40-minute calls. It's a mundane, soul-sucking thing to do, but there was no other way for us to ensure quality. Now we have had one developer on the side, on the periphery, experimenting with some of these things, and we've stitched together a pipeline of open source AI models and technologies. Some language models like Llama, speech-to-text models like Whisper. So there's a pipeline through which these calls just pass, and now we get nice transcripts out of each call, and it's a continuous thing. Calls keep on going in, zero manual intervention or supervision. And once you have nice transcripts of these calls, automatically made from one of these models, you can run language analysis using something like Llama and get meaningful insights from it. Were there a lot of pauses? Was the customer happy, unhappy? Basic sense. Now, will this system take any sort of a decision? No. That's also another policy that we have. These systems will aid decision-making, and the decision-making lies with humans. Now, instead of sifting through hundreds of thousands of calls, the team just has to look at the calls that the system flags. That's saving them 99% of the effort. And the efficacy of the entire process, where you have a bunch of these metrics, and analysis of language, tone, style, etc., length of the call. So the sample size that you get, that this model outputs, is already high quality. So you're not picking up random calls where there's nothing to find. So this is a big, big deal for the organization. The process of quality, the quality of a customer support improves, and the lives of about 100 people also improve. That's a very tangible example made entirely using open source models, running on a super, super cheap cloud infrastructure that we self-hosted.
So that's a wonderful integration of AI and human, that I could say that. I mean, I could put it that way. So then coming on to like how you're using AI for the transcripts, like evaluating it. So then now there are a lot of limitations also to AI models, like the whole hallucination, it's a black box, etc. So do you think employing this AI for this function can also have its own challenges? So can you talk about that? And also, as a whole, what are the generative AI challenges that maybe enterprises will also face when adopting these kind of technologies?
Oh, absolutely. There can be serious challenges. I'm not a fan of the word hallucination in language models because that behavior that looks like hallucination is inherent to how language models work. That is how they work. And when they work in ways that we don't really want them to work, we call it a hallucination. So we shouldn't anthropomorphize that too much. But absolutely, that's a big challenge. If you start relying on language models for critical decision making, uh, imagine using language models or some of these similar models for that you employ for automated insurance claim decisions. That could be disastrous. The example that I cited was where it's purely an aid to a human, and the agency of decision making, the accountability of a certain decision lies with the human. But if you start depending on these models for decision making itself, then I think that's a very dangerous path to go down, especially today, because we're talking about stuff that has been around for like 3-4 years in that sense, right? So the challenges are not really technical. There are many technical challenges, but I don't think that is what really matters. The challenges are going to be of decision making and agency. And organizations looking to adopt these things should be extremely wary and cognizant of the decision-making capabilities of these models. Yes, they will easily make decisions, but most likely they'll end up being wrong and disastrous for the org. So the focus should be there. Our focus is absolutely there. Yeah, so it's not just about hallucination, it's about humans losing agency of decision-making. And another thing, and I think we've already started seeing that in some places, is if you end up employing black boxes in areas of decision making, when something goes wrong, nobody knows where to point fingers at. You reach out to customer support says, but the system says it's wrong. Customer support escalates it to a management layer somewhere, they're like, but the system said it's wrong. So once the system decides, and the system is so entrenched in an organization, nobody really will even remember after a point what went wrong. And if the system says so, the system says so. So I think those are the biggest risks. And irrespective of the kind of AI technologies that you use, these risks are inherent. And these are the things that occupy my mind, at least.
So then how would companies know when to draw the line, or how should they approach this when it comes to adopting it? So what are some of the steps that they can take to prevent such kind of failure?
I think it's common sense. There's no formula to this. It's the same with adopting any kind of technology. However, these technologies are of a different class altogether. So organizations really have to stick to first principles. Do not rely on these things for critical decision making. Now, if you do, make sure there are paths to fall back to, graceful paths to fall back to. The system says something, it's obviously wrong, then there should be a clear process for that decision to be deferred to humans. So it's just common sense. But if you're overhyped and you really want to incorporate this everywhere, then you've already lost that.
So then, just again, a little extension to that is, so there are a lot of misuses also that happens with these things. So you say AI can help, but at the same time, it can also expedite the kind of breaches. So especially in a finance sector, how can companies take like stringent steps to ensure that does not happen?
That's a tricky one. So abuse and misuse of technologies have always been a cat and mouse game. Now, when these language models help you deep fake live videos on a webcam, or deep clone and fake somebody's voice, things like KYC, etc., become really difficult. Even your unsophisticated spam calls, where people would just randomly dial you and try to sell you something. You know, my mother got a call from the RBI governor last month. So, not joking. I mean, RBI governor, but she hung up immediately because I've sensitized her enough. These calls can now sound realistic and very sophisticated. How do you beat them? How do you overcome them? I don't really know. It has to evolve. Just like fraud is never going to stop. You will have sophisticated fraud. You will have sophisticated fraud prevention mechanisms. Then there'll be slightly more sophisticated fraud. It's an absolute cat and mouse game. And fraud has existed throughout human civilization. So we'll just have to figure out and evolve and be more careful and cautious. A lot of things that we take for granted will have to go away.
So like you said, so each time something new comes up, you kind of find new ways to counter that, but then something progressive comes up. So, so does it, I mean, can we say that this will never end, like any kind of misuse? You cannot probably say AI will solve all these things, like say deepfake problems or those kind of things.
No, it'll never end. For as long as there are human beings, there will be fraud, there will be scams, and technology accelerates everything. Technology accelerates good stuff, technology also accelerates bad stuff. Forget AI, internet, the advent of internet, which was meant to be the global information superhighway, which it is, also accelerated fraud, right? People sitting in a country can now defraud people sitting in other countries. That was never possible before the internet. So it is going to continue, it is going to accelerate forever.
That's kind of sad to hear. But so now with the capabilities the AI models are coming out, can we say that in the near future it would surpass human intelligence, or would AI still remain as a tool to just augment human capabilities?
And this debate goes back, I think, again, thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, philosophers were philosophizing about machines that have cognition. So we still have not been able to describe objectively what consciousness is, what intelligence is, what self-consciousness and self-awareness are. So it's a very tricky question to answer. This question has no answer. If we can't even define intelligence, how can you discern? But when LLMs became like a big deal a couple of years ago, there were a bunch of people, a whole school of thought that said and truly believed that LLMs internally have attained some sort of self-awareness. Not human-like, but in their own right. But then there were other big camps that said that, no, that's absolutely not true. So unless you can agree on a framework for intelligence, I don't think it's possible to even definitively say that, oh, this thing is generally intelligent. 5 years ago, if somebody said that there'll be this chatbot that will be able to interact with you exactly like a human being, solve real problems for you, speak to you in natural language, nobody would believe it. But today it's become commodity, and the goalpost has shifted. So LLMs are not even considered intelligent anymore, and all it took was 24 months. So the goalpost will keep getting shifted. Will, at some point, I don't know, centuries from now, will we attain non-biological artificial intelligence? Highly likely. But will a lot of people still say that that is not real? Highly likely. It's the no true Scotsman's thing.
So then the discussions that we have today on AGI, artificial general intelligence, and a lot of these leaders talking about how we'll get there in 2 years or 5 years. So does it mean that we've also not got the definition right? Like, what is AGI exactly? If they're saying it's something that can be easily achieved, then I think something's not right.
It must be their definition. They must have some definition that they've made up for what intelligence is. And it might be very intelligent looking behavior or technologies, but for anyone to say that it'll happen in 2 years or 5 years, no way. I mean, you can't. It's physics, it's biology, you really can't. And people have been saying that from the 50s and 60s. In fact, before there was computation, before there was general computing, people were trying to build AI using analog technology. So AI research and hands-on AI modeling predates general purpose computing. And AI was always 5 years away from the last many, many years. Today we have amazing breakthroughs built on many decades worth of research, but to say that in 2 or 5 years or 10 years we'll have AGI is, I don't know where that's coming from. Probably business reasons, valuation reasons, I don't know.
So just coming to the end of it, so anything that you want to say on, say, what would be the future trend, or what do you foresee will happen, say, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years? With the whole, say, the way the AI has expedited in the last 2 years at least, is there something that you see? Or something that can go wrong as well?
I think predictions of future, especially with technologies, have always aged like milk. And I have my foresight when it comes to technology is very, very limited. But that these things are going to be commonplace is a given. There's evidence that what large language models, when they came out 2-3 years ago, people assumed that these things can only really work on massive systems. Today, you have really good models running on Raspberry Pis, tiny little computers. It only took 24 months of decentralized open source innovation. So these systems are going to keep getting better and better. And I think they're also going to open socio-legal regulatory conundrums. A big hot topic right now is the very basis of things like copyright or intellectual property. What does it even mean in the framework of machine intelligence, right? And from that perspective. So I think a bunch of legal conundrums are going to open up. Regulators are going to try and regulate, but from the looks of it, these things can't really be regulated. Yes, the good actors can be regulated. They can be made to abide by frameworks and laws, but the bad actors don't care. So that's just going to accelerate. So acceleration is going to happen, good and bad. That seems like a given. These things are going to get better and better. That also seems like a given. But anything beyond that, I'm unable to predict.
Got it. Thank you so much, Kailash. I think, yeah, we have a lot to look forward to and be wary of as well.